In this video, I'll be ranking what I think are the most overhyped Olympia wins in all of bodybuilding history. These are wins that aren't necessarily bad or controversial for a negative reason, but wins that were blown away out of proportion for being far greater than they truly were. Remember though, guys, this is just my opinion, and please do not take it all that seriously, as it is all in good fun, but I would love to hear your opinions down below. For the tiers, S+ is for wins that are remembered as mythical, flawless, or untouchable, but in reality were not as good as they seemed. These are the most inflated Olympias in my own opinion, where hype and legacy far exceed what was on stage, though the wins were still obviously amazing. S is for great deserving victories that are talked about today as more dominant than they actually were. A is for strong, respectable wins that do get a little bit too much credit compared to what actually happened. B is for deserved victories that were hyped more by the moment, storyline. B is for deserved victories that were hyped more by the moment, storyline, or narrative, rather than the physique itself, and that extra hype is not really one that has aged strongly, I would say. C tier finally is for barely overrated wins, celebrated a bit extra in the moment, but without any lasting inflation. And basically, for a recap, I would say that the higher the tier, the more overhyped it was, and the lower the tier, the less overhyped it was. First up, we have Arnold Schwarzenegger's 1975 Mr. Olympia win. This is remembered as one of the most famous moments in all of bodybuilding history, mainly because of the film Pumping Iron, which arguably is the most popular piece of bodybuilding media ever. The film positioned Arnold as the heavy favorite, and I would say that that was true. By this point, he had already had 5 Mr. Olympia titles, and he was definitely the favorite. His biggest competition obviously came from guys like Lou Ferrigno and Serge Nubret in the over 200-pound class, and then from Franco Colombo in the under 200, who he would have to face in the overall comparison. Now, he did bring the best combination of size, shape, and condition for the time, and I do not really think anyone can argue that he did not deserve to win. But here's the thing, the way this show is remembered today is almost entirely because of the legendary nature of the film. Without that, cultural impact, the victory probably wouldn't be talked about much more than his 1973 win, and might even be overshadowed by his much sharper and larger 1974 physique. So while he was definitely the rightful winner, the reputation of the 1975 Olympia has been blown up far beyond what I, actually think happened on stage. That's why I have Arnold's 1975 Olympia win in S+ tier. Not because he wasn't great, but because the hype has elevated the win into a mythical sort of status that it doesn't really fully deserve. Next up, we have Samir Bannout's 1983 Mr. Olympia victory. This show took place in Munich, Germany, and it came at a real sort of crossroads for the sport. The golden era was winding down, and just a year later, Haney would begin his reign of dominance. The 1983 lineup was wide open. Frank Zane was past his prime with a torn rotator cuff. Haney was still a rookie, and Mohamed Makaway, who looked incredible, kind of lacked a lot of the size to truly dominate. That opened the door for someone like Samir, who had always struggled with the water retention, I would say, and condition overall earlier in his career, and obviously post-1983 Olympia, but finally he nailed his condition just at the right time and walked away with the Sandow. On that night, Samir obviously brought a look that many fans do call today one of the most perfectly balanced physiques ever. His arms, his back, especially that famous Christmas tree, and even his legs looked incredible for early 1980 standards. And make no mistake, Samir was the rightful winner. His combination of symmetry, fullness, and posing carried him to his one and only Mr. Olympia title, making him a sort of one-hit wonder champion in the sport. But here's where the overhype comes in my opinion at least. With the resurgence of classic physique today and the nostalgia for the golden era, Samir's 1983 win often gets looked back on as if he was kind of untouchable or brought one of the most legendary physiques ever. The reality is that while he was excellent, don't get me wrong, the field was not exactly stacked with a lot of dominant threats, and his physique, though beautiful, does not really quite match the myth that has grown around it. So in the context of this tier list, I would say that Samir's 1983 Olympia win lands in A tier. A deserved and very respectable victory, but one that gets a bit more credit than it truly warrants today, I would say. Also, if you guys are enjoying the video so far, like and sub would really be awesome, as it helps out the channel tremendously. Coming into the early 90s, we land at Lee Haney's 1991 Mr. Olympia, his shot at the record-breaking 8th Sandow. Haney came in with a look that people still call his best overall package: massive width, fuller arms than in previous years, polished posing, and that champion calm that really sells every single pose. Also, this was after that controversial drug-tested 1990 Olympia, so he looked a lot better and kind of unrecognizable this year. But this wasn't an easy win, unlike it, may have seemed. Dorian Yates arrived with that same imposing silhouette and harder, grainier density even compared to Lee Haney, especially from the back and in the hamstrings and calves. Prejudging definitely told the story here. From the front, Haney's width and roundness was far better. From the side and back, I would say that Yates's etched detail and lower body pop made things really uncomfortable for the reigning champion. You could feel the audience surge every time they lined up, at least from first-hand accounts, and it was obvious that this was the first time that Lee Haney had truly felt a real threat. By finals, Haney did what great champions do. He tightened up his presentation, looked even fuller up top, and executed a very confident routine that played to all of his strengths. In the end, Haney obviously won, but it wasn't the kind of dominant victory that fans sometimes do suggest. It was an experienced champion holding off a new force that was already casting a pretty long shadow. So yes, it's a fitting finale and arguably Haney's best, but the myth of a very dominant send-off kind of overshoots the reality of a close, gritty win. That's why I'm placing this one in S tier. It was a great and deserving win, no doubt, but it's remembered as far more dominant than it really was, since Dorian definitely pushed him extremely hard. Moving on, we hit 1993, the year most people point to as the beginning of the mass monster era, thanks to the emergence of Dorian Yates' insane physique. He came in with incomprehensible size and density for the time, paired with amazing, sharp, grainy condition that he had been building towards in years prior. Many fans today look back and say this was an easy runaway win. Some even say this was Dorian's best ever and one of the greatest Olympia physiques of all time. But in reality, this show felt more like a fork in the road for the sport. Flex Wheeler made his Olympia debut that year and presented the complete opposite look. His conditioning was obviously there, but his lines, aesthetics, and proportions and posing brought you back to that golden era. His physique was prettier to look at as well, with rounder muscle bellies, symmetry, and flow that stood in stark contrast to Dorian's grainy, kind of blockier style. It really was the battle of opposites here. You had the mass monster, crazy condition, and freak of freaks at the time versus a very aesthetic icon. While Dorian did win and technically presented his most balanced package ever before injuries and imbalances crept in, I think the way this victory gets remembered is a little bit overhyped. It's talked about like he was untouchable and that Flex was never really in the conversation, when in reality both physiques were polarizing and the results weren't really as much of a landslide as history makes it seem. That's why I'm placing Dorian Yates' 1993 Mr. Olympia win in S+ tier. It was a legendary win and maybe his best showing, but the way people mythologize it as an effortless and flawless win makes it one of the most overhyped Olympias ever. Next on the list is Ronnie Coleman's 2003 Mr. Olympia win, a contest that many fans call the most dominant performance in all of bodybuilding. And to be fair, on paper, it absolutely was. Ronnie came in with an almost cartoonish combination of size, condition, and just freak factor as well. His arms were freakishly round and full and separated, his back dwarfed everyone else's on the stage, his legs looked like tree trunks, and there really wasn't anyone else close to him in terms of sheer muscle mass, density, or condition. I'm almost certain that the audience that night knew they were witnessing something special. But as impressive as Ronnie was, I think the way this win is remembered doesn't really line up perfectly with what actually happened. First, the lineup was not nearly as strong as people make it out to be. Jay Cutler was still developing and not yet at his 2009 best, nor at his 2001 peak up until that time, and while Dexter Jackson was as sharp as ever, he was definitely too small to be a real threat. When people talk about 2003, they frame it as if Ronnie was crushing one of the deepest and most competitive fields ever, but in reality, the standard was not as incredible as the legend may suggest. The other issue is obviously Ronnie's midsection. This was probably the worst his waist ever looked in terms of his prime. It was distended, wide, and took away from the flow, and for all the freak factor he brought, his waistline kept him from having a lot of balance and aesthetic polish that some earlier versions might have had. Yet despite this obvious flaw, 2003 is almost always brought up as his ultimate form, the so-called greatest physique ever. So yes, Ronnie was light years ahead of the lineup and probably had the most dominant win in all of Olympia history. But when people treat this as an absolutely flawless package, I think that's where the overhyping comes in. That's why I'm placing Ronnie Coleman's 0-3 win in S+ tier. An all-time dominant win, no doubt, but remembered with a level of perfection that ignores the weaker aspects in his physique and in the field as well, and the clear flaw of that midsection. Next up is Jay Cutler's 2006 Mr. Olympia win, the night he finally dethroned Ronnie Coleman. This show has gone down as one of the most famous Olympias ever, and for good reason, because it ended Ronnie's streak at 8 and stopped him from setting a record that still stands today. Jay came in around 280 pounds, I think, at least the heaviest of his career according to him, with a full, solid look that closed the gap between him and Ronnie, and many fans had been waiting to finally see this happen. But here's where the overhyping kind of comes in. The win is remembered less for how great Jay actually was, and more for the fact that Ronnie lost. When people talk about 2006, the narrative is kind of about the end of an era, not the quality of the physiques themselves. And when you look closer, the contest was definitely tighter than the history makes it seem. Yes, Ronnie definitely had some clear flaws. His lat tear and tricep atrophy were becoming more and more obvious, especially in the front double and rear lat spread. But outside of those shots, he looked very respectable and in, a lot of the cases, very competitive. In fact, you could argue that he won the rear double and he definitely held strong in poses like the side chest and most muscular. Almost every other pose was very close. It wasn't a competitive collapse from a, winning perspective for Ronnie, and it wasn't a blowout win for Jay. It was a battle that they had, and the judges decided in favor of the younger, fresher, less injured competitor who could carry the sport forward. Ultimately, Jay did deserve the win, no question, but the way it's remembered today by some as if he dominated Ronnie doesn't really quite match what happened. It was historic and very symbolic, but it was not lopsided by any means. That's why I'm placing Jay Cutler's 06 victory in S tier. It was a deserved win, but its legendary status it had then and today comes more from ending Ronnie's reign rather than from the physique Jay actually brought to the stage. Now on to 2013, we get to fill Heath in what many people call his most dominant Olympia win. The evidence definitely seems to back that up as well. At prejudging, he only had one call-out and the judges sent him back right away because he was definitely far ahead of the pack. From a pure bodybuilding standpoint, Phil looked enormous, full, and very detailed, and arguably at the absolute peak of his career. But here's where I think the hype goes a little bit too far. At this point, Phil was starting to show some signs of midsection growth, and while his fullness made him look absolutely freaky, it also took away a little bit from that streamlined aesthetic that he had in, let's say, 2011 or earlier. To me, his 2011 physique was far better, still full but tighter, more balanced, and with a much prettier flow. And even though his 2016 version might have had worse midsection control, it came with more size, similar fullness, grainier condition, and maturity that made it look denser and more imposing. So yes, 2013 might be his most technically dominant win, but that doesn't mean it was his most impressive. The way people frame it today as Phil being miles ahead and completely untouchable is not quite as true either. Kai Greene was still very competitive, bringing massive size and his trademark dramatic presentation, and Dennis Wolf had width and structure that, in certain poses, even outshined Phil. Overall, I would say that Phil was obviously the clear winner, but the narrative of this being his flawless, greatest ever look adds more hype than it really deserves. That's why I'm placing this one in A tier. It was a dominant one on paper, but the way it's remembered kind of exaggerates how far ahead he actually was. Jumping to 2018, we come to Shawn Rhoden's unexpected Olympia victory over Phil Heath. To me and many others, this show is remembered for bringing back the aesthetics and streamlined midsections into the Open Olympia. After years of distended waistlines at the very top, Shawn's flow, symmetry, and clean lines definitely felt like a breath of fresh air. His win was immediately framed as the return of aesthetics and as a statement that the judges were rewarding shape again, but the actual contest was much closer than the storyline may say. Heath came in with an even more improved back, which is pretty impressive and surprising, great density, and also that full muscle maturity. The problem was that for the second year in a row, his midsection was completely out of control. It was basically distended and sloppy enough to cost him shots like the front double and ab and thigh. Shawn capitalized on that, but when you go pose for pose, Phil was still harder to beat than some might suggest. In the side shots and from the back, he had the size, the detail, and the dominance that Shawn could not match. What Shawn did have, though, was a far better midsection, amazing condition, and an overall presentation that looked more pleasing to the average eye. It was enough to sway the judges, and even the head judge, Steve Weinberger himself, said that it was a very tough decision. But outside of aesthetics and condition and things like that, he didn't really actually win many mandatory poses that convincingly, apart from maybe the front lat spread and the abs and thigh. Now, overall, that's why this win, while very historic and controversial, is not massively overrated in hindsight. It was controversial, yes, by, a large margin, but people don't really talk about it as being this sort of untouchable or mythical type of win today. Honestly, it seems like people quickly accepted the win and the direction the sport was heading in, which is why there really isn't much hype about it now. So I'm putting Shawn Rhoden's 2018 Olympia win in B tier. It was a justified call given all the flaws Phil had, but the hype around it was not that extreme compared to the controversy to make it truly overrated. Next up is Big Ramy's long-awaited breakthrough at the 2020 Mr. Olympia. For years, the narrative around Ramy was if he ever nails his condition, he's gonna win it all. And in 2020, that prediction came true, or at least that's how it was presented at the time. Ramy walked away with his first Sandow, and the hype was definitely immediate. The mass monster who had been chasing his potential for years had finally put it all together. But when you really look at this version, I don't really think nailing it is the most accurate way to really describe this one. Yes, he was full, balanced enough, and imposing from the front, with a side leg that was absolutely insane, but the details were not all there. His hamstrings and glutes were not ultra sharp, his quads still lacked a lot of that separation, especially in the hip flexors, and from behind his lower back looked flat and very atrophied. The upper body was very impressive in terms of size and fullness, but the grainy condition and etched detail that we associate with Olympia caliber dominance really was not present. That's not to say that it wasn't a deserved win. I definitely think it was. Ramy was still the best overall package on stage, and the judges rewarded him accordingly. But the way it was hyped in the moment, as if he had finally delivered a flawless, lights-out performance, doesn't really quite hold up looking back. He was good, but not the dialed-in, razor-sharp version fans had been imagining all those years. And because of that, the hype around this victory has kind of cooled off. People don't really talk about this one as one of the greatest Olympias of all time, just as the year he finally got it done. That's why I'm putting Big Ramy's 2020 Olympia win in B tier. It was deserved and historic for him personally, but the initial excitement has obviously faded, and it's not really remembered as a truly legendary performance. Now let's look at Hadi Choopan's 2022 Olympia win. From a fan perspective, especially in Iran, this was a monumental moment. For years, people argued Hadi was overlooked or even robbed in placings, and 2022 felt like the year the stars kind of aligned for him. He came in with that razor-sharp frontal condition he's known for, pretty good lines and polished posing, and just enough size and balance to take the title. He wasn't freaky in terms of mass compared to previous champions, but I definitely think that night his conditioning was untouchable. The problem is the hype that came after. I saw polls where fans claimed that this version of Hadi could stand toe-to-toe with 1999 Ronnie, which is widely considered the greatest Mr. Olympia ever. Others even said he would beat Dorian Yates, Heath, or that this was one of the top 5 physiques ever. That is simply not realistic. Even at his all-time best, Hadi's total package is not on the same level as those legends, unfortunately, and framing 2022 like it was one of the greatest physiques of all time is where the overrating kind of comes in. And the truth is, it wasn't even a runaway. Derek Lunsford looked even more aesthetic frontally, had the better back poses, and really did have a case for winning despite it being his Olympia debut in the Open. Nick Walker was also right in the mix, bringing that freaky size and condition that could have earned him the title. Hadi had the density and maturity to win, but the top 3 was very close, and much closer than the fans made it sound. So while the win was deserved and it was a huge moment for him and for bodybuilding fans in Iran, the idea that this was some sort of all-time top 5 physique is what makes it very overrated. That's why I'm putting Hadi Choopan's 2022 Olympia in A tier, a strong and deserved win, but given far more credit than the reality of the physique as well as the competition that night. Finally, we get to Samson Dauda's 2024 Olympia win, one of the most talked about recent Olympias. It was framed as a return to aesthetics and shape in the open division, similar to that of Shawn Rhoden's win in 2018. You had a champion with a lot of flow, lines, and proportion that fans felt bodybuilding had been missing. And to his credit, Samson did look incredible. His structure is amazing, his side poses are among the best in the game, and he clearly deserved the Sandow that night. But in terms of how it's remembered, I do think people sometimes forget the flaws. Out of the top 3, Samson was the least conditioned, especially from behind. His glutes and hamstrings were far better than in past years, but still not at the level of someone like Hadi or Derek, and even Martin Fitzwater arguably looked a lot more detailed and consistent across all areas. From the back in particular, Samson's lack of separation stood out against rivals who were a lot sharper and, crisper. It's also worth remembering how close the contest was. Hadi Choopan and Derek Lunsford pushed him pretty hard, and Martin's name kept coming up in post-Olympia discussions about how well he actually stacked up against the top 3, including Samson Dauda. So while Samson's win was well-deserved, the idea that it was some sort of dominant runaway victory does not really match the reality. That's why I'm placing this one in C tier. It was a great and deserving win, no doubt, but only slightly overrated, ever so slightly I would say, with the hype kind of being centered more on the moment and obviously that return to aesthetics, and there really isn't any lasting inflation on how it's remembered, even though it was only a year ago. Anyways guys, that about does it for the video though. Please let me know down below your thoughts and opinions in the comments, and I do hope you enjoyed. With that all being said, please don't take it all too seriously, it's just my opinion, and I do hope to see you on the next one. Thanks for watching.